Sally, and today we're going to talk about your baby's brain. Did you know that in the span of human development that the first 3 years are the most important time for your baby's brain development? Did you also know that your baby is actually working on their speech development even before they start talking? Today, we have Danielle Twemlow, who is going to talk to us about your baby's brain. Danielle is from the Parents as Teachers program through Topeka Public Schools, and she is going to give you ideas of what you can do as a caregiver to enhance your baby's brain development and what you can do to learn more about your baby's brain development. So Danielle, we're ready to hear about our baby's brains.
Hi, friends. Good morning. I hope you guys are all having a really great day. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you guys. So like Sally said, I do work for Parents as Teachers. I also work at a hospital teaching childbirth classes, breastfeeding education. I'm a Better Brains for Babies instructor, and I'm a safe sleep instructor for Kansas. I'm also a Red Cross instructor. And I say that because I want to let you know that in all of those realms of things that I do and I teach, brain development is always important. So brain development comes into play a lot in our lives. And so regardless of where I'm teaching or what I'm doing, I'm oftentimes relaying information back to brain development. And the thing about brain development is it's ever changing. We're constantly learning new things, and it's really complex and it's really cool, really neat things. And we can always learn new information, and it can also be really overwhelming. So my goal here today is to really kind of touch base on some of the very basic things about brain development, the stages of how the brain grows, and some things that you can do at home and every day that are really easy and really simple ways to connect with your baby and help that brain grow. So hopefully you have some questions for me, and we'll stop and pause and all that good stuff. But we know that some of the basic things that we can do is touch. And one thing you're going to see when I start my PowerPoint is I label it, "You can't spoil your baby. Better Brains for Babies means more touch." And this is always a big pet peeve of mine. And so anyone who's been to any of my classes hears me say it all the time. And we'll kind of talk more about why that is, why that touch is super important too, along with some other things. So I'm going to go ahead and start over to my PowerPoint screen so I can show you some pictures and talk you through some things. So I'm going to start it at the beginning. These are, I always have to put pictures of my kiddos in there. So I have lots of them and even a little grand kiddo over there too. So, which is pretty exciting. So the brain is pretty complex. It's split into two different areas where we have kind of mimicking lobes. So we have our frontal lobe in the front. You can see that in purple. Parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe, which these are just basic things that kind of help you visualize how the brain is split up. And each parts of these brains are in charge of different functions. So we start this brain development even in utero. It's actually kind of one of the first things that develops is called the neurotube. So some of you might remember how it was really important to start taking prenatal vitamins right at the beginning, like even if preferably before you became pregnant. And that's because the neurotube is the first thing that really develops. And the folic acid that we find in prenatal vitamins helps prevent neurotube defects or mishaps in the development of that neurotube. And so that happens pretty quickly, about 5 weeks after conception. And lots of other things start kind of coming into play and pulling off of that neurotube to start developing. So really surprisingly, some coordinated actions even start happening in utero, like hiccuping. So later you might, in pregnancy, remember feeling a constant repetitive motion that was kind of really on beat. That's hiccuping. They'll start stretching and yawning and sucking and swallowing, which they actually swallow that amniotic fluid and digest all that. So, and them sucking. So by the second trimester, some reflexes start developing. So like coordinated breathing movements, like the diaphragm and stuff, sucking and swallowing. That's controlled by the brainstem, which is pretty interesting that though these things are functioning and starting to develop in utero, we still don't have, like, we would still need some help outside of the body at this point. But the heart rate, breathing, blood pressure is really starting to regulate. So by that third trimester, the cerebral cortex is starting to mature. And that's a lot of what we kind of think about as mental life function, conscious experience, voluntary actions, thinking, remembering, feeling. So really, lots of things can start happening in about 34 to 35 weeks-ish. If you recall, in pregnancy, sometimes you will have to get up several times through the night to go to the bathroom. And oftentimes, if you start charting that, you'll notice that you're getting up around the same time every single night, whether it's between 2 and 2:15, or you're waking up between 4 and 4:20. The reason we start doing that in that kind of routine way in utero is, one, we're just kind of having Mother Nature prepare us for waking every 2 to 3 hours to feed our baby once they're born. But those sleep patterns start developing in utero. So the baby at about 34, 35 weeks are already starting those sleep patterns. So if you notice that you were getting up between 2 and 2:15 every morning to go to the bathroom, it's probably because baby was starting to wake up, was moving around, signaling you to wake up as well. That's probably going to be a feeding time for baby once they're born. So that's kind of interesting and a neat thing that those are already occurring. The other thing that we really know with that familiar sounds and the familiar odors, that's why after a baby's born, we bring baby right onto mom's chest, skin to skin. So all that fluid and amniotic fluid and that vernix caseosum kind of gets all over baby or mom from baby. And that's a very familiar scent for baby. And that's really helpful and calming to them as well. We know babies that do that skin to skin immediately after birth have better heart rates, better body temperatures. They tend to eat better. Mom's blood pressure is better. Mom's heart rate's better. And things just tend to flow a lot easier if we start that skin-to-skin contact as soon as possible after baby is born. But I'm going to go back to that part about sounds in utero. So one of the things that we know about with that connection and starting that attachment with our baby is that we can actually start singing a song or reading a book to baby in utero. So there's some really neat studies that show that reading the same book or singing the same song every day to your baby in utero, they will respond to that after they're born. They tend to relax and calm because they understand those speech patterns and they remember that voice inflection that you had while singing that song and reading that book. So that's a way that you can start attachment and connection even in utero. Start singing a song or reading a book, which is pretty cool. So another thing that's kind of interesting is, so there's some really interesting instincts, some reflexes that babies develop in utero that they're kind of born with. So like reflexes are things that you just instinctually do without really having been taught it. So babies have a few of these. For instance, the Moro reflex is a reflex where when babies are laying there really calmly and then all of a sudden they shake their arms and legs out. That's a startling reflex that happens. Or when you put your finger in a newborn baby's hand and they grasp it. Those are reflexes. We didn't teach them to do those things, but they instinctually know them. There is something that kind of develops right around 37 weeks, which a full-term pregnancy, we consider 39 weeks, but 37 to 41 weeks is considered where we oftentimes aren't interfering because most babies are doing well. Half of the time, 36-week babies may need some extra help or some time in the neonatal intensive care unit. All babies born at 35 weeks or sooner would. But what happens right around 36 to 37 weeks is the suck, breathe, swallow mechanism kicks in the brain. That reflex, that kind of instinctual motion happens where they can drink, breathe, and swallow that all at the same time. Okay, so that's a reflex that has to kick in, and a part of brain development that oftentimes isn't till about 36 to 37 weeks is a really secure reflex that babies have. So that's oftentimes, if we see babies born around that time, feeding issues tend to be a big cause of some complications. And it's usually once they hit that due date, they kind of just pick it right up. It's an interesting thing to see. It kind of goes to show that brain development happens in stages, which is also kind of an important reason to understand brain growth and development. It kind of helps us understand expectations for babies and children and toddlers, even into the teenage years. So understanding brain development gives realistic expectations and can help us determine what a child or baby or teenager should or shouldn't be doing at any given time, or what's expected of them. Babies do change and grow at different rates, and you always hear about little ones who do things at an accelerated rate, and sometimes we have little ones who do things at a little bit slower rate. But it's really important that we keep track of it. And home visitation is a really good way to do that. There's lots of different programs that are available and free in our community. But another way, if you're not doing a home visitation program, you can actually go to the CDC's website and you can look up milestones. So you can download an app for your phone that goes by months and kind of gives you a little bit of a breakdown of milestones that your little one should be doing. So you can kind of watch for them or practice them. Sometimes we don't know that we should be practicing different skills to help their brain grow and develop. So checking on those milestones is really important. That's also why going to our regular healthy baby checkups is super important. And I know it seems like we do it quite a lot before that first year, but it's really important to keep on track of those milestones and make sure, excuse me, that growth is going the way that it should be. Okay, so before we kick into after baby's born, do we have any questions about prenatal development?
I think that you can go ahead and go on with the parts of the brain.
Okay, great. So I wish I was as clever as Anita Daly, who came up with this order of brain development little tunes. So much of us are probably used to singing nursery rhymes and whatnot. And she put together this nursery rhyme, Order of Brain Development, to Frere Jacques, which was super clever. And I wanted to make sure that I shared it with you. I am not a singer, so I won't necessarily do that to you, but I will kind of go through this as it has great information. So the brain stem, which begins that, like we talked about, that neurotube, is coordinating those life functions like reflexes, breathing to survive. So those things like the suck, breathe, swallow mechanism are just normal heart rate, those types of things. So that brain stem gives us our coordinating life functions. The cerebellum is the little brain. So it's timing and movement, posture and balance to coordinate. So I'm saying these in a really specific, really kind of slow way, because begin to think about if you've had a little one, or you've got a niece or nephew or a friend's kid, and you're thinking about their growth. We're not immediately walking when we're born, right? That takes some time to learn that coordination, the balance, and movement. So keep thinking about all those different things as we go through this. The limbic system, the amygdala and hippocampus, process sensory memory, perceptions, emotions. Though that's big. This is going to be a huge part of how children react for quite some time, actually. So really, the cerebral cortex begins last. The outer layer house thinking and reasoning. So if you remember back in your teenage days where your mom and dad maybe said to you, I know I heard it, you need to stop and think before you act. And that's because we were functioning a lot off of our emotions and a lot off of our immediate perception. That cerebral cortex, the more front part of the brain that controls logic, cause and effect, and more long-term type of thinking. Some of the most recent research is really suggesting we've pushed it back from 20 to 25 to probably 25 to 30 years old before that cerebral cortex is really firmly developed, is some of that new research. So teenagers just don't have that function. And really, babies and infants and toddlers absolutely don't have that function. They're so far from that cerebral cortex being highly functioning that lots of logic is not quite there for them yet. So when we're talking about spoiling, a baby spoiling, or wanting to manipulate us, if we think about those things as learning systems, processes of our brain developing and growing and figuring out those limitations, it can make it much easier to handle if it's not that negative perception. So it feels really negative when I think that a toddler is trying to manipulate me. But if in turn I'm thinking, oh, my toddler's brain is growing, they're trying to learn limitations, they're trying to figure it out, and it's my job to steer them in the right direction. That feels better. That feels like more of something that I can manage versus working against each other. So sometimes rethinking our behaviors and our development of our little ones into what their bodies are going through makes it easier to manage and handle. So it's pretty remarkable that at birth, there are 100 billion neurons when a baby is born. And that kind of through the process of learning and growing and developing, our body does different things. So migration, where our cells and neurons are moving to different parts of our body, our brain, and using them the way they need to be used. Pruning, getting rid of neurons and connections that we don't need. That's a process that's constantly occurring. Definitely that migrating happens the first 8 to 10 months after a baby is born, and pruning can happen for a few years. And then it happens again when we are in the older generation. And that happens, you might know, like when you're reading stuff about preventing brain degeneration and the older generation, the older population, that doing crossword puzzles and lots of reading helps stem that off. And that's because that pruning or getting rid of neurons that we no longer use or need is occurring again. So constant stimulation helps prevent that from happening. So we have 3 parts, just a bit of more detailed information again. The cell bodies, this big part here, hopefully you can see my cursor. Dendrites, lots of them going off, and then the axon. Okay, so the different parts of receiving information up the axon to the cell body, deciding where that happens through those dendrites and making those connections in a process called synapsis. Okay, you've maybe heard this too. It's actually a small gap between neurons. So that connection to that axon to dendrites of other neurons is where information flies. Okay, that it's transmitted between each other, and then these pathways form where information happens. Hopefully you can still see me on my screen, and I'm going to try to show you something. So what happens if you think about connections of neurons is if I were to draw a line and I were to say, okay, I want you to trace over this line, okay, you would have to be really careful about that, and you would have to work really hard to make sure that you can stay across that line, right? Because it's a really thin line. But if I made it a really, really big line here, okay, if I made a really thick line and I said, okay, now run your pencil somewhere across this line, you could do that much easier, right? Because I've made a wider, thicker line. Well, this is kind of the same process when we're talking about building those pathways in our brain. The more times a pathway is used, the thicker myelination or covering over that axon becomes. And the thicker that covering is, the faster information processes. Okay, the faster it can travel across that axon, the thicker that it is. So that's kind of an easy way of thinking about it. The more times we use a pathway, the quicker information is going to process because we're myelinating it, which is one way of doing it, by using it often, touch, different ways that we'll talk about too, where we can encourage that myelination, including breastfeeding if you're able.
I think we have a couple of questions, Danielle.
I would love them.
Okay. The first question we have is, when is my baby's brain fully developed in utero?
So back to where we were talking about the different processes. Our brain really isn't actually fully developed until we're an adult, until between the age of 25 and 30. So our brain is constantly growing and developing in those stages. So it's actually not completely fully developed, as in those pathways haven't all occurred and secured, and learning all that information, it's not all there yet. So we actually continue to develop our brain until adulthood.
Okay. The next question is, when does a baby in utero's brain begin to work?
So there's that's a hard question. And there's a lot of different pieces to that, actually. So that's kind of hard. So the science tells us that they can start developing some of those reflexes. They can start doing things like recognizing tones and sounds and light later in that third trimester. So roughly, when we consider it full term, at 37 weeks to 39, we prefer 39 weeks, but at 37 weeks, we're not really interfering. Then we know that they have a lot of those developments of reflexes and things to oftentimes do just fine once they're born on their own.
Okay. And then the last question I have is, does it matter what I read to my newborn? You talked about the importance of reading in utero. And then when you have a newborn, what is a good reading suggestion for newborns?
Oh, that is a fabulous question. I'm so glad you asked that, because it doesn't matter what you read. It's the sounds and it's the inflection and it's the words that they're hearing in that connection that really make a difference. Sometimes we don't have a lot of books available. We're really fortunate in our community that we have the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. So make sure that if you, once your baby is born and before they are age 5, I believe, they can go to the Shawnee County Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library website and sign up for free books through the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, and they will be mailed every month to your house. So we are really fortunate to have that in our community. We also have a lot of little free libraries. We have our Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library, where we have a wonderful program where you can get a library card for your newborn. So definitely make sure. But it's hard to sometimes get out, and right now they're not open, right? So you can read whatever is available. I remember when I was going through some college courses, I would read my textbook out loud to my newborn that was laying next to me while I was reading and studying. So it doesn't matter what you read. It's just making sure that whatever you have around, read it out loud. If you're cooking, read the recipe out loud while your little one is sitting maybe in their pack and play next to you, or you have them in your sling. You can read that recipe out loud, talk to them out loud, sing that song, that nursery rhyme. And we have then where they're hearing lots of words. So that's a perfect way to do it.
Oh, that's great information. And thank you so much for sharing those resources that we have in our community.
Yeah, it's always great to access as many resources as you can get.
All right.
Okay, so those are great questions. Keep those coming. Synaptogenesis, or making that connection. So rapid production prenatally and during that first year. That's why it's also really, we'll talk a little bit about this later. We want to make sure we stay as healthy as we possibly can, even prenatally, because we know that that affects that growth, those interruptions of those growth, even starting prenatally. So we have 50 trillion synapses at birth and 1,000 trillion by 12 months. So the synaptogenesis is that connection that's occurring, that firing off and connection of those neurons for processing new information. So that's pretty remarkable. If you think about it, most things every day that babies are experiencing are brand new. And that's pretty neat to think about. And again, those connections that are used regularly become stronger. So a lot of new research is coming out of the Center on Developing Child from Harvard University about epigenetics. So this kind of goes way back to the whole nature versus nurture debate. Are babies born with absolutely all the type of makeup that's going to determine everything about them? And what we really know from lots of research is that there are lots of things that contribute to that, and that actually life things like stress or even illnesses that may affect our body can change growth and development. Stress being a big one. And right now we have a lot of stress in our life that everyone's experiencing on different levels. So we all have a different level of stress right now, and none of it is more or less important than another person's stress level. And that is really affecting how we live every single day. And so it's really important to remember that our stress level has an effect on how we are as a parent, but also how our baby grows. Babies can experience that stress, and it actually changes their brain chemistry. We know this actually from studying babies from orphanages in Romania back in the early 90s. It was kind of a very common thing for babies to be taken to orphanages. It was encouraged by the government, but the conditions of the orphanages were not ideal. And actually, so much so that I oftentimes, when I'm doing these presentations, I just can't ever show the footage coming out of those orphanages because it's hard to see. And it's really a lot to take in. And so we knew that when we started this research, when we kind of went in to kind of help with those things, there were anywhere from babies all the way up to age 8 on average in most of these orphanages. And there was roughly about 100 children per one caretaker as an average. And their job was to feed and change and move on, keep that routine with very little touch and interaction. There was the fear of spoiling the children and making them cry or want more, which was not the developmentally appropriate thinking. And also, they didn't have time. There wasn't enough caretakers to give attention to these children. So oftentimes they were left alone in cribs without much touch. So when researchers went in there, they did lots and lots of different tests on these babies. And many of them had IQs that were in the 50s to 60s range, which a normal IQ is about 100. And they brought in speech pathologists and caretakers, and they adopted these children out to smaller home settings and reevaluated these children and they found that very few had changes in those IQs to any drastic measure. But there were small groups of children who did, and they really kind of focused in on that. And they found out that those small group of children who didn't even have the same caretaker had their beds all by the back cleaning closet in this one orphanage. And while the cleaning lady filled up her water bucket, she held their hands and sang a song. And so that physical touch and interaction that those children had changed the pathway in their brain to process information differently from there on out. It was pretty remarkable. And so lots and lots of research stemmed from this. And we began to look farther into really what does touch and interaction really play that role in development of the brain. And we know that it's a lot. So I have a really cool little trick I want to show you too. I use this when I'm teaching even in childbirth class. So I have this little device. Sally, can you see it?
I can. Okay.
So when we have skin-to-skin contact, we make a connection. Okay. So I'm touching this skin-to-skin. Okay, that skin-to-skin contact makes that connection. If I were to have a whole room of people, we could make this go off. Now, I'm going to use a sock, and I'm going to wrap it around one. So if I'm touching over clothing on one side, but I'm still skin-to-skin on the other, I don't have that connection. I'm not making that same connection with that body as if I'm doing skin-to-skin. So when we're talking about touch with babies, when we're talking about touch with other human beings, that skin-to-skin contact has a different type of effect on the body than over the clothes. So that's an interesting piece too. So skin-to-skin is really important. So what are some things that you can do? We've talked a lot about these. So we know that prenatal massage decreases maternal depression and increases birth outcomes. We know that that touch is really important for moms. It reduces stress. It gives that skin-to-skin contact like we just showed. And when moms are less stressed and when moms feel less of that depression, then we know that babies are going to grow better. And we know that they're going to be able to respond better to their children. So oftentimes when I'm teaching childbirth class, we practice massage techniques. And I usually say the homework is you're going to do 30 minutes of massage 3 times a week. And it's really kind of a great idea to alternate with your partner, whoever that might be. So the next day, whoever gave you the massage, you get to give them a massage. So keep up that communication, keep up those practices, but prenatal massage can be really important. Now, I do know not everybody likes to be touched, and that's certainly sometimes the case. And that's why communicating is really important. Have that open conversation. If you aren't someone who really likes to be touched, you need to speak with whoever your support person is about what you do need to feel a connection. What might that be? Is it having a 10-minute conversation at least every other day with someone you really care about? Or do you feel best connected with others if you write notes or play a game? Whatever it might be, you need to have that communication with your support person about what you need to feel connected. And so oftentimes for a lot of people, touch and massage can be that. But if you're not one of those people, I want you to find what is what you need. And so continue that even after babies are born. So we talked about reading prenatally. Awesome. And then even from day one, we want to keep reading or keep singing that song. So even if you don't have that book laying around yet, you haven't started up that library, singing a nursery rhyme, singing a made-up song, those are all still really helpful on building literacy and helping that brain grow. Feeding is also always an important way. So regardless of how you choose to feed, there's ways that we can connect. Breastfeeding has lots and lots of good things for both mom and baby. It's a healthy option, but if you are not able, if you have exhausted your resources, remember we have lots of resources in our community that can help answer your questions. If you check on either of the hospital websites, you can find free classes right now for sure, and make sure you access and ask questions even to your healthcare provider if you're wanting to learn more and get that support you might need to make that happen. So breastfeeding has a lot of skin-to-skin contact, obviously, and lots of touch that's occurring. And oftentimes it kind of gives us an opportunity to look at our baby, to talk to our baby, and to give that touch. So I really encourage that if you're choosing to, or if you need to be bottle feeding your baby, whether it's formula or expressed milk, that you spend some time, particularly in the beginning, with maybe unbuttoning your shirt and doing some skin-to-skin while feeding your baby a bottle. Another really important thing that you might want to do while feeding a bottle is oftentimes switching sides, and not always feeding baby on the same exact side, but switching sides. Looking at your baby. Sometimes we forget to do that. Either way, breastfeeding or bottle feeding, we oftentimes will pick up our phone and we're messing with it while we're feeding because quite honestly, it's a time that we're able to sit down, right? But this can be a really important time where we have undivided attention of our baby. Where oftentimes they'll get to a point after the first several weeks where they can look around while they're eating. That's a developmental milestone they don't do right away. But once that happens, you have their attention to be talking to them. Oftentimes, as they even get a little bit older, they might start reaching for your face because their vision isn't terribly great as newborns. They can see you pretty much from your elbow to your face. But as that starts growing, they might start reaching up to your face. And that's a great opportunity to say nose, and interact and give that opportunity for that brain growth even during feeding. So propping our bottles or lots of time on our phone, those are lots of distractions. And as our babies get older, they're going to still kind of want that attention even during a feeding time. So those are ways that we can continue to encourage that growth even during feeding.
Danielle, do you think it's a good idea for dads to do skin-to-skin?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great idea. So we find it really important, definitely even in the hospital setting. So if there's ever situations, like for instance, sometimes during a C-section, then maybe a mom might not be immediately available to do that skin-to-skin. We encourage dads or support people to be that person as soon as baby's ready to do that skin-to-skin contact with. We do that even with babies in our neonatal intensive care unit when they're able. If the baby's healthy enough to do skin-to-skin, we encourage it even with dads. So skin-to-skin contact is important regardless of how that happens, but it's a really great opportunity for dads to connect too. I know that sometimes dads, if a mom is breastfeeding, I've heard lots of feedback about, well, how do I connect with baby if I'm not doing the feeding? And feeding is only, it seems like it's taking up an entire part of the day, particularly in the beginning. But dads have lots, or support people, have lots of opportunities to connect. We have infant massage, we have reading, bath time, diaper changes, times where we can still find ways to do that skin to skin and touch and connect. So yes, definitely still do it.
Thank you. I do have a feeding question. I had somebody ask me about once the baby starts eating more solid foods, what is a good brain food for baby?
So when babies at 6 months-ish, when babies often start eating more solid foods, they're really an accompaniment. They're really starting to just get them used to the texture, to getting their mouth muscles working, to be able to swallow thicker textures, to get the movements going, to use their tongue in a way, and eventually start practicing that hand-eye coordination with using a spoon correctly. So really from 6 to 12 months, it's really a lot of practicing. We don't want to replace breastfeeding or formula, which has a lot of those nutrients for brain development that we still need for brain growth. So we're really using food during that period of time to get used to all those other skills. But we really want to kind of hold off as long as possible on things that have the natural sweetness in it. So that's why we oftentimes encourage cereal for texture, and it's also, all those cereals are fortified. So oats and rice and barley are fortified with lots of good nutrients. And then starting off with those vegetable series, because that is definitely not naturally as sweet as fruits are, and then holding off on those until a bit later. But after that first year, then we really start using those foods for nutrition value, because we are no longer providing the formula or breast milk as readily throughout the day for that nutrients. That's why we switched to whole milk at a year old, because whole milk has the fat that is needed for continuous brain growth until the age of 2. So that's a really good question, and that's kind of like a small rundown of it. And at this 4 to 6 months well child checkup, the doctor usually goes over some of those staggering things based on exactly what your child might need.
Okay. I have another question here. Somebody was asking about how can if I have an older sibling, how can they help with baby's brain development?
Oh, that's such a good question. One of my favorite classes that I used to teach at the hospital was the big brother, big sister class, that sibling class. And so oftentimes it's really important to get older siblings involved so that they, it kind of reduces that natural jealousy that might occur. But singing songs and talking is absolutely supremely a great way. We oftentimes, even prior or when babies are really, really small, for toddlers, it's a great idea to start practicing with babies, like pretend babies, on soft touches, and like soft touches on the feet. That skin to skin rubbing on the feet or the legs is a massage that older siblings can do. But older siblings tend to do very good at singing songs or telling stories, which is perfect way to get them involved.
Okay.
Those are great questions. So massage. So you can tell that this little one has had lots of touch in her life and really seeks out that touching. So making sure that we do lots of that massage and touch. So I put this picture in here because as you can tell, we have little Wonder Woman here who is very strong and independent. And one of the things that we really learn from lots of touch and lots of response is that tends to be a form where children can learn to be more independent and learn trust. So when children are responded to when they have needs, they learn to trust their instincts and they learn to trust you as their caretaker and their environment. So oftentimes more touch equals less clingy children. So that tends to be a fear that if I hold my baby too much, or if I respond to every time they cry, they're just going to be clingy and they're just going to be, you know, a mommy's girl or a mommy's boy. And that's so far from the truth of what we know about brain growth and development. So when babies are not responded to, they learn to not trust. And so when they're not crying, when they eventually learn to not cry, it's almost a form of they just don't know what to expect. So babies don't have words, okay? They don't have really ways to communicate but crying. So again, if we think about things differently, if we think about crying as a form of communicating, it allows us to figure out ways of what the baby might need. Now, this isn't going to be all the time. We have what's called the purple period of crying, where babies sometimes cry for long periods of time for unknown reasons. And long periods of time, I'm talking sometimes a couple hours. Often it's the same time every day, and it can be a very predictable thing, but we just don't know why. And I say responded to because I mean you might try feeding or changing the diaper or rocking or walking or singing a song, and sometimes none of those things work and baby just still cries. And that's all that you can possibly do. And we have to recognize when we're at our limit, when our brain, our mirror neurons have kicked in. So mirror neurons are in our brain that reflect what we see. So when we see a baby cry or when we see someone upset, our mirror neurons kick in, and that's why we start feeling upset as well. We're learning, we have that empathy where we're responding to what we see. And it can be the opposite too. Like you might, that expression of, you know, when she walks in the room, everything lights up, because it's opposite too. If we're smiling and we're happy, mirror neurons from other people pick that up and they smile and they're happy. So when we hear and see a baby cry and we can't change that, it brings a lot of anxiety. And oftentimes it can make us start feeling almost angry. Sometimes we start noticing we're clenching our jaw or our hands, where we've raised our shoulders. Our heart might beat faster, and we're starting to feel upset. So if you ever get to that point, it's really important to lay baby down somewhere safe, alone on their back in a clutter-free crib, and go ahead and walk away for a minute. That is not you leaving your baby to cry it out. That is you taking an adult timeout, and that's okay. And if you have to call someone in, do that, okay? Call in grandma, call in a neighbor, call in a friend if you don't have anyone in your house. But sometimes we all need that break, and that's okay too, okay? So responding to your baby means that you've tried what you need to make sure they're safe and have what they need, but sometimes they just cry, okay? So that's a difference that's important to point out.
Danielle, you mentioned the period of purple crying. Is there anywhere that some of our viewers can get more information regarding the period of purple crying?
Yes, so there is a website that you can just Google the period of purple crying, as well as it is once you deliver at one of the hospitals. I know at least one of the hospitals gives out the DVD when you deliver, and it might actually also be on their website too, but you can certainly Google the period of purple crying and go onto their website for that as well. But it's good to reiterate all of those things so that you know it's very normal and that you're not doing anything wrong, that it's a pretty common thing for babies, and we don't know why. Still one of those things about brain growth and development that we haven't quite figured out yet.
Okay. I do have a question. We have somebody asking that they had heard to avoid eye contact during night feedings to avoid stimulation. Is that important, or is it better to continue touch and eye contact?
That is one of the hard questions. Sleeping is one of the hardest ones. And there's lots of a lot of different methods about the best way to go through nighttime. And that really depends on age, temperament, making sure that there's not other health reasons that are causing this, and growth. So sleeping issues, nighttime issues are a really good thing to bring up with your pediatrician, just to make sure you're ruling out all the different things. And so if a pediatrician decides baby's really healthy, there's really no reason why we shouldn't be sleeping more. We're growing well. We're getting enough feedings in. There's no other sorts of issues like vitamin levels or things like that that could be causing it. They can really talk you through a really good method on making that. So it really depends on age too, on our expectations for that.
Okay.
Well, that is the end of my PowerPoint.
Okay. Is there any other questions that, I think another question that we have is there a difference between a girl and a boy brain?
I have, my husband is biology, anthropology, and he will tell you there is not a lot of difference. But there is some pretty interesting research about how the brain grows differently and how boys and girls might be attracted to different things. There's some really good documentaries on PBS that I find really interesting that you can just search PBS for those things, and oftentimes they're free for viewing. But again, that's one of those continuously researched things that we have right now that have no definitive answer to them, because it's again one of those epigenetic type things. How much does environment play a role versus genetics? So that's one of those questions that is constantly being looked at. So that's a really good question.
I will also mention that on Netflix, there's a great program called Babies.
Yes.
And it talks a lot, it has a lot of new research information and a lot of information on babies' brain development. So that is a great series to watch when you're at home now.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in the very first episode, they actually redid the still face experiment, which is pretty remarkable to see, which is where they place babies and their caretakers really close to one another and do that interaction with that talk and that touch and all those great things that we know helps build that brain growth. And then they have a period of time where the mom or caretaker gives no expression or no emotion any farther and no longer touches. And it's kind of heartbreaking to see because you see the anxiety rise in the baby and the infant and eventually becomes very frustrated and upset. And here's the remarkable thing. Here's the really cool piece that they came out of this. Once they went back to able to touch and interact with that child again, the children who had secure attachment prior to this experiment had less instances of the really negative hormones being released in their brain. So the babies who had insecure attachment, meaning they didn't have lots of interaction with their caretaker, they didn't have that trust and that bond that had formed with lots of touch, lots of talking, lots of interaction, their brains during that period of time of no touch and no talking spilled a lot of negative hormones in their brain. It really flooded their brain with cortisol. So that's remarkable. The babies that had more secure attachment were able to handle that moment of stress better than the babies who had insecure attachment. So that was pretty remarkable to see.
So once the baby's brain does get that cortisol in it, how does that affect it on down the line? How does it affect your child on down the line as they grow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we're finding that it actually can have very long-term effects. And it kind of goes back to that Romanian orphanage stories about those children who spent time in that orphanage. If they were there longer than the first 6 months, research down the line showed that they tend to have effects into adulthood. And so that's really detrimental. You know, it really affected how their brain was wired, and those repetitive neuron motions, they weren't there. They didn't have that constant synapse and that growth. And there's a period of time where we take in information and our brain decides where to send that information. And so when we're sending it to spots of our brain that are in constant fight or flight, where we're constantly worried, that's that secure path now, where we're going to route a lot of our reactions to that fight or flight. We're in that constant state. So that insecure attachment can actually have lifelong effects.
Okay. Another question we have is, what if a baby fusses during a massage? Is there a wrong way to do it?
That's a really good question. So I actually have right here with me baby cues, which I use very often, which are just cards that kind of, I use them when talking to people about recognizing different cues. So watching your baby's cues is really important. The fussing, so is it fussing or is it crying? Is it just making different sounds because we don't have really good words? Or does it seem like we're grimacing, we're turning away from you, we're not making eye contact? Those are forms of disengagement. So that is your baby telling you, I don't want this right now, I don't like it. It could be maybe they prefer to be on their tummy and you massage their back while you're right there. Or maybe they don't want their leg rubbed. Maybe they like you rubbing in circular motions on their tummy. So try different things. It could be that they're cold and they want the top half of their body wrapped up while you massage the bottom. Experiment with different things. Also, time of day. Oftentimes, massaging really stimulates the body. So sometimes it makes babies hungry and then they want to eat right away. Not a great time to do it right after bath because their body temperature typically decreases a bit after a bath from being cold, you know, in the wet. So it's not always a great time to do it after a bath because that might make them fussy. But so those things could happen. It might be making them sleepy and tired because it's relaxing them. It might make them a bit hungry because it often stimulates those things. Or maybe you just need to try a different position. But you're right to watch those cues. Watch for disengagement and try to gauge whether it's just being fussy or they seem to be really disliking it.
And speaking of cues, if you're giving, as a caregiver, giving a massage, should you cue the baby in that you are going to be giving the massage, or how do you suggest that begin?
Yeah, you know, that's always a great idea. You can, you know, I always tell families too, it's hard to make a whole spectacle out of it. You know, you don't always every time have to get a special blanket and all the lotions out and, you know, make sure the lights are dim. It doesn't have to be that way. I remember having to go back teaching pretty shortly after I had my second child, and he would come to classes with me. And so while I was talking in class to my classes, I'd have his socks off and I'd be massaging him. And later down the road, I realized even after he wasn't coming with me anymore and I was holding pretend babies, I was still massaging the feet of those babies. So you can find times, I know, I would catch myself, you know, and you'd get a chuckle from a dad every once in a while. I realized I'm like massaging the legs and the feet because it was a routine that I had to make sure I was still giving him some sort of interaction while I was talking with the class. And sometimes I would teach to his face, but you can find times to do that, particularly in a busy life. If you're riding the bus while you're sitting and waiting for the bus stop, rub those feet, rub those legs, and pump and massage those legs. Read a book while you're waiting. Massage can also take place, you know, as you're preparing. I might have already said this, preparing for the bath. As you're taking socks off, rub the feet. As you're taking pants off, rub the legs. Your shirt off, rub the arms. It doesn't have to be a a really like class that you have to take, although there's lots of good classes on infant massage as well, and I'm sure you can find lots of them on YouTube and other places. But it's certainly just about doing that touch and doing that that eye-to-eye contact if it's there, to connect with them. Certainly as they get older, always ask permission before touching. That helps really teach them to be in charge of their bodies too.
Okay. Well, Danielle, thank you so much for sharing this great information on brain development. You have a lot of great information to share. And do you have a contact information if anybody would like to ask you further questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to, I can certainly send forth my, my email, which is just Danielle.Twemlow@gmail.com. So my first last name @gmail.com. And I always love to get questions.
Okay, perfect. And so thank you for joining us with Discovery Baby. Next month, we are planning on having an Ask the Pediatrician. And if you need further information regarding Discovery at home, you can go to kansasdiscovery.org. Have a good day.
Thank you.